So welcome for those that just followed the safe cracking, or for those that were in the safe cracking talk before ours. That was way cooler. Hopefully this doesn't disappoint. But we're really going to talk about modern approach to incident response. My name is James Carter. I'm the Director of Security Informatics at Mayo Clinic. We thought about wearing scrubs to do this presentation, but we decided against it. And we're located in Rochester, Minnesota. And for those of you that don't know what security informatics means you probably don't work for an academic medical center, but it really just means I have responsibility over both the response functions, so all the monitoring, detection, and response functions, as well as the offensive security team, so a lot of the red team functions as well. I've been at Mayo for 2 years, and before that I spent 6 years at Mandiant. I refuse to call it FireEye, so if FireEye's in the room, I apologize. I'm still going to call it Mandiant until the day I die, but I spent 6 years there, and then before that I was in the IBM pen test team as a part of ISS.
And I'm Jessica Hebenstreit. I am the manager of the Threat Analysis and Response Center under Security Informatics. Think Security Operations Center, basically. Today is my 1-year anniversary of being at Mayo Clinic. Prior to that, I worked for an insurance company in the West Des Moines area, and I worked for a few other small companies like Motorola, American Express, GoDaddy.
Right. And we're using Prezi, and we're going to try to see if this works and all our icons stay, so just bear with us. Monitor, detect, and respond to threats is a pretty kind of common nomenclature in regards to either incident response or security operations, but just to give you a little bit of a scale of what we have to deal with, at Mayo Clinic, most people know Mayo Clinic as a academic medical center. They go there for healthcare, things like that. But all the pieces that are involved in providing that care, that are under the covers, people don't really realize. So for those that don't know, Mayo Clinic is divided really into 3 shields. They call it the practice, which is the healthcare shield, which is everybody is aware of. They have an academic component where they're actually a full-fledged college, and they also have a research component as well. So that's really what makes up Mayo Clinic. However, other pieces like we own an airport. So for those that don't know, the airport in Rochester, Minnesota is actually owned by Mayo Clinic. We own a power plant. We own a water treatment facility and a steam producing factory. We own a farm. We have a credit union, and all of these actually are all within our purview. And probably the most important piece is that we also have medical devices that are actually attached to patients that have IP addresses and sit on our network. So those are all pieces of our environment. And I think we're estimating, and this should give you a good indication of where healthcare is in information security, we're estimating that we've got between probably 250 and 350,000 IP addresses that are on our network at any given time. So that's the full scope of Mayo Clinic. Anything to add on that? So monitoring, detecting, and response means a little bit different whenever the device is actually attached to a patient and the other piece of it is attached to the network. That makes it a little tough. Just like every other organization, we deal with the same threats. We also treat VIP patients as well. So if you're a political figure or something like that, a lot of times you'll go to Mayo Clinic for special care. So we have a lot of different threats just like everybody else. The ones that Jessica's probably sick of dealing with is all the commodity stuff with viruses and phishing attacks and worms and things like that. But we also have other ones like we have insider threats too. So healthcare institutions, by the way, have a lot of drugs. A lot of times people that you hire may be interested in those drugs. And some of the machines that dispense those drugs may not be as secure as you'd like them to be, but we have insider threats like that. And then we also have insider threats like people joining other firms or other companies or competing firms and being able to track some of that information. Hacktivists, not everybody loves Mayo Clinic. So we do have some hacktivism type pieces where people are out there on the social networking scene and talking about us in certain ways. We have some terrorist functions, actually. Surprisingly enough, we've discovered some of that. We've got organized crime, and we also have state-sponsored attack groups. So based on, if you can imagine, if you provide health care for some dignitaries overseas, other countries may have an interest in how healthy they are. So we actually have to prepare for that as well.
Well, in addition to that, James, we have started partnering with other medical institutions in other countries that may not always be as friendly as we would like them to be. So recently, Mayo Clinic announced a partnership with a group in China. So you can imagine how that increases the threat in that area.
Yeah, it always makes our day. So what we're really going to focus on today is automating a lot of the incident response lifecycle. We're really focused on detection analysis, containment, eradication, and remediation. So what we're trying to do is prepare our environment to be able to handle all those different threats in an automated fashion. We've got a few vendors and strategic partners that we've worked with, and we've really focused on integrating all their different processes together. And for those people that have tried this before, sometimes a lot of the vendors don't play well with each other, even though they all claim that they have APIs and that they can all talk to each other. That usually isn't always the case. Luckily for us, we have a little bit of a heavy fist or a heavy stick in the medical industry. So usually if we say we want this to work, they'll make sure the API will work, or we actually have people on staff that'll reverse engineer some of their stuff, and we'll get it to work for us. One of them actually, a guy that works for us, Ryan Summers, recently reversed it. We haven't told the vendor yet that we reversed it, so we'll have to disclose that first before we release any kind of white paper, but he basically reversed one of the ways one of the vendors actually takes in the data and can disperse it within its own system to work to our advantage in a bunch of other systems, so we can have multiple systems communicating with each other with the same data set. So that's really what we're really focused on for this talk. And if you want access to the scripts or any of the XML code or anything like that, we can provide that to you. Just come and talk to us afterwards, and we'll probably have to email it to you at some point in time after we clear it with some other vendors. Buzzword, big visibility. This is probably the first step that we had to look at Mayo Clinic. As you imagine, the plethora, we have SCADA systems, like I had mentioned, we have medical devices and things like that. Getting endpoint visibility was something that was really critical to us. Identity visibility as well, being able to understand. I mean, we have operating rooms where doctors can walk in, not so much at our main campus, but at some of our health systems campuses where they walk in and the room recognizes who they are, and they can basically, they take their badge and they just swipe in, and it recognizes and it logs onto all their different systems. So we have to understand, what's the difference between a doctor in the OR and the doctor that's in his office, and how do we manage those identities? So that's been a huge challenge for us. And it's something that we're really tackling, but getting visibility on the identities, the applications. We've got people that go in surgical rooms with iPads and take pictures of things, and obviously there's patient data involved, so you have to be very careful with that, but getting full-on visibility of the endpoint as well as the network. Anything?
Google Glass has also been a challenge in some of our ORs. And so, when you think about not only from a security perspective and a HIPAA perspective, but also, there's things about making sure that Google Glass is sterile in the environment. And so it's really about partnering across several different business units. So
today's talk is on automated response architecture, and really to reduce the response time down. Make it manageable for a lot of our staff, see if we can reduce, maybe not reduce headcount, but not require as much headcount based on automating a lot of the stuff that the folks are working on. So if you can imagine, and Jessica will go over some use cases later, if your staff is working on 80% of the time phishing attacks that is commodity, if you can automate that, you just free up 80% of your FTE count to work on something that's actually more advanced from an attacker perspective. So increase our knowledge of internal and external threats. So I may have forgotten to mention that I also have oversight over threat intel. So we're developing a threat intel program as well, and we'll go over some of the different groups how we've had everything broken out. But we're developing our own threat intel so we can be aware of internal and external threats. So if Johns Hopkins or one of the other medical centers gets hit with something, maybe we will have some heads up in regards to that and being able to implement some controls on our side to help prevent that. And obviously, the objectives is the integration of technologies, enterprise visibility, and then real-time threat intel, and tying all those different pieces together to get it to actually work. Inventory of tools. So for those of you that didn't get a full greenfield to play with whenever you first got to your company, you probably had tools that were already in-house, just like we did. We got rid of some and brought some other ones in, but we didn't really get a full greenfield to play with. So we had to take an inventory of what we had, not just from an information security perspective, but from an IT perspective as well. So IT may run things like Tivoli or Titanium or things like that we might be able to take advantage of. So it was more than just an inventory of the security technologies, but what do you already have in your IT infrastructure that can actually, that you can leverage to be able to perform these things a lot faster.
And sorry, James. So in addition to that inventory, it's not just, we have Tanium and we have Tivoli and we have Blue Coat or whatever proxy. It's then what APIs do the vendors claim are available there, and what processes are up for grabs for automation.
Just be careful with that. They claim a lot of things. Sorry to the vendors that are in the room. Evaluate current processes. We got lucky. We really didn't have a lot of current processes 2 years ago, so we get to develop those from scratch. But again, more than just security processes, look at your IT processes. How does an identity get developed, or how does an identity get profiled and assigned to a certain individual? What decommissions that identity? What are some of those processes? Because those are all going to impact what you do and what you set up. And then metrics. Again, luckily, 2 years ago we didn't have any metrics in security, so we got to develop those from scratch. But those are all real important pieces. And just to give you a little bit of a lay of the land of what we've been able to do with these metrics is, from a leadership perspective, our C-levels have been totally bought into everything that we've done. And we've been able to show a really quick return on investment on a lot of different areas. That's already, if you want to sum it up, we've already been able to save the company millions of dollars in a lot of different areas just based on the work that we've done. And usually millions of dollars rings well with your CFO and things like that. So we've been able to produce those metrics that really resonate with them and able to actually get even more budget. So our budget's actually pretty outstanding for any company. It's probably the biggest budget I've ever managed by a long shot. And it's probably because of all the metrics and what we've been able to produce and show them the ROI on it. So this is Jessica's group, and this is really the focus, and I'll let her take over and kind of explain her group, but the focus of how we've structured our organization is that we really want all security events and to be handled at the lowest level. I don't want to have to go to an incident response and some kind of enterprise-wide incident every single time we turn around. So we're really focused on handling everything at the lowest level, and this group is really going to be the largest group at Mayo from an information security perspective, because if we do our jobs right everywhere else and automate everything, a security event that bubbles up should never ever get up to an incident level. And I know that's probably a pipe dream for a lot of people, but that's really what we're focused on. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to explain in your group and what you actually do.
Yeah, so basically my group is in charge of, the initial monitoring and running of the tools. We run the SIM, we get all the logs and collect them and run them through the various parsers and, matching against signatures, and we have heuristics and stuff we can do. Basically, my team is in charge of triaging everything that comes in. So if we carry the medical metaphor a little bit further, we triage all of the events that come in to keep them from coming to a high level incident that requires incident handling. So we deal with severity 3 and severity 4 level tickets from an incident response perspective. This is your malware, your commodity malware that, a system needs reimaged or cleaned, that kind of thing. We got a phishing email and we need to block some of the, websites that they're going to. And then we do a handoff to the incident response team for things that require a more specialized incident response. And then we provide support to that team for ongoing analysis and information out of the tools.
And I think one of the main differentiators is that, a lot of people may be sitting there and saying, that sounds like a security operations center. We don't actually do firewall rules or anything like that. We actually focus on a couple different areas where it's more of a proactive hunting group. So they actually go out and hunt for evil on the network and look for things that are bad. And in addition, we focus primarily on behaviors. So that's probably the other piece that's a little bit different than what a lot of security operations centers do, is that a lot of them are very rule-driven, very signature-driven. It has to match this, and then I'll set off an alert. We do a lot of work with behaviors. So we want to look at if identity X, if they access 5 systems every single day and all of a sudden they access 15 in a day, that's going to trigger for us because that's a behavior pattern that is out of the norm for that user. And if you put your system in, you can actually, even though a lot of companies say, we have 60,000 employees, how can we baseline every single user? Just watch it over time for a little while. And we can watch things over time. We can watch system behavior over time. We can watch application behavior over time. We can watch identity behavior over time and say, okay, this is not a normal behavior pattern for that user. And then we tie those behavior patterns to some use cases that we'll talk about that may indicate a different type of threat that may be in your environment. So I think that's probably the differentiator, is that focusing on behaviors and what's normal versus what's not normal. You might call it anomaly detection or whatever you may want to call it, but in an operations center function, at least from what I've seen, a lot of it's been just rules and things like that. And a lot of times things don't fall nicely into a rule that tells you you're compromised. Usually you have to, there's some other indicators of compromise that show up beforehand, and usually it's based on behaviors. And that's how you can kind of separate the noise in regards to what's considered lateral movement by an attacker versus like what's regular IT guy going to his file share. So that's what you'll have to be able to do. Of course.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Oh, no, there's actually, and this will, I started out in this industry in the mid-90s in the Air Force, and the network guys kind of handled the firewalls, and they handled some of that component. Well, if you fast forward time for me, but you don't fast forward time for other industries like healthcare, the network guys still handle the firewalls. So they still handle the firewalls and a lot of the rules and things like that. And you'll still need that. We still have antivirus, we still have firewalls, we still have, intrusion prevention systems and things like that. And those are things that you're going to want to integrate into. But you may not have, other than just oversight of the rule, you may not be the guy that actually goes in and types in the rule to allow something or not allow something. So yes, firewalls and all the normal security controls are still needed. Sure.
Just to clarify real quick that I understood it correctly. So your incident response team only gets involved when the incident reaches a certain level before everything else is handled at your level?
So my team does a level of incident response. They're all trained incident handlers, incident responders, right? But we have, and James will get into it with the incident response slide here, but we have folks that have more experience or more specialized skill sets in certain areas of incident response.
Exactly. It's like a hit team almost, where you bring them in whenever stuff's hitting the fan. We have a few. I used to joke around and we have malware analysts on staff that are part of this incident response team. We have forensic investigators that have worked for a lot of firms, whether it be government or private sector, that that have been in kind of the battle in regards to either enterprise incidents or even like dead box forensics and have taken the stand for different cases and things like that. So we've got folks on staff that do that. I joke around with our malware analyst team that I used to reverse engineer malware, and they always laugh because I say I used to run strings. And I said, yeah, I just run strings on it, I'm good. And so I joke around with them about that, but they actually can take things down to a very, very in-depth level pretty quickly. So the gentleman that we have on staff actually used to work for DCFL and Bank of America and a few things like that. So he's an ex-Air Force guy too, so he's quite well known in that industry. Yeah. With clinical engineering, we're actually pretty integrated. So we actually, that's a great question because most people don't think about that unless they're in the healthcare industry. We actually have a specific group in information security that's our liaison to the clinical side. We do. We will. Yep, we will. So, some of the stuff I can't go into certain devices and manufacturers, but we'll actually do incident response. We monitor medical devices. That's actually something we're in the middle of right now. So we have a liaison group that works with our clinical folks, our clinical systems, nursing, the biomed people and things like that actually are more responsible for the medical devices that are out there. And we actually have a lot of their log data that's going into our SIM. We can do forensics on it, and also the red team that we actually have, the pen testers, they actually test medical devices as well. So we're actually working with medical device vendors to say, hey, look, this doesn't cut it. So if you want our business, you need to be able to fix all these different security gaps that are in your device. So our red team does that for us on the medical device. So both sides are involved with clinical systems. And even clinical software systems, electronic medical records, things that are probably pretty important that if got out, we'd be in a lot of trouble. So we monitor those as well and help with that. The other things, I guess this slide is pretty self-explanatory, but this is the second level of how we structured it. So it's primarily more of a hit team for us. Threat intel, this is actually, I would say, obviously is everybody's buzzword. Luckily, Ed McCabe, who just did a threat intel presentation yesterday, actually works for us as a contractor half the time. So we've started a threat intel group at Mayo Clinic, focusing on both external attribution, threat actors that may have an interest in us, as well as gathering some of that intelligence, and then also looking at inside sources as well. So we talked about the whole issue with like insider fraud and things like that we have, those patterns and things like that we may want to link to, hey, do we have people that are actually here at our organization that may pose a threat from an insider perspective? We actually have, when I went to my orientation, there was actually more, my new hire orientation, there were actually more temporary 3-month kind of medical folks from all over the globe that were there than there were full-time employees that were U.S. based. So we had, folks that come in, they do medical research, they come in for 3 months, they come in for 1 month, they come in for 6 months. They like to bring their own devices on our network, they like to do all these different things, but we actually had more of those temporary type employees at Mayo than we did full-time employees at my new hire orientation. It was actually really interesting. So we really want to look at some of these different threat intel pieces. Yeah. We are very integrated. So in order to get, so we're actually working. We actually have a separate risk group. They have a control of audit and a few other functions. Compliance and privacy actually report to them. We're very tightly integrated with them. We don't do legal discovery work. Thank you. I cannot stand that work. So if anybody, sorry, no offense to people in the room that love it, but I am not a fan. Actually, at Mandiant, when I was there, we almost got rid of that entire service line because no one wanted to do the work. But we have a separate group that's tied in closely with legal, and we're actually really close with our chief legal counsel for obvious reasons. But there's a separate group that does that work and really closely tied in with them too. So we have a lot of business partnerships, and obviously the obvious one is IT. We're very closely integrated with them, but risk, legal, even HR, compliance, all those we have very strong relationships with. The other part too is we brought in some outside experts, and I'll cover I think in a later slide what our threat intel infrastructure looks like today and how we have it tied in. So it's pretty self-explanatory. We want to get the intel before we get hit with something, and then use it to our advantage. So some of the use cases, and I mentioned before, the use cases are primarily behavior-based. So and we want to look at it from two factors. We want to look at from a factor of what's the biggest pain points we're experiencing. So especially Jessica's group, what's the biggest pains that if they have to deal with it one more time, they're all going to quit. Usually that's phishing. But what's the biggest pain points, and what advances us in a way that we can actually find bad stuff in our environment? So we're looking at, it's kind of like a two-factor advantage here. If we can tackle both with our initial use cases, that's awesome. And it actually helps us out quite a bit. The one thing we don't want to do, which is what a lot of companies do, they say, hey, look, we just throw all this data in somewhere and start going through it, and then you don't ever advance anything because you haven't tackled specific use cases. And I think that's been another differentiator of how we've been able to be successful, is we said, this month we're going to tackle this. This month we're going to tackle this. And we just move it down the line. And we try to get as much of the noise out of the system that way as we can, so we can actually just really focus on more of the advanced threats that may be in our environment, and more of the things that a rule's not going to trigger on, more of the hunting kind of stuff that an MD5 is not going to hit on, or any kind of hash is going to hit on. So that's really what we're focused. So the initial set of use cases that you'll see here today were kind of our, out of the box, what do we want to do? What gives us the most bang for the buck immediately? And that's what we'll cover here. So I'll let Jessica hand over so she can go over the use cases.
So I have 3 different use cases to go over. And basically, we talked about at the towards the beginning of we took an inventory of the tools available to us, both within security and IT, and kind of what our major pain points were. As James was saying, what do my analysts not want to deal with one more time? What is taking up the majority of their time and taking them away from being able to do that proactive hunting that we want to be doing? So as James alluded to, phishing is I'm sure a lot of you run into this at your jobs. This is probably 80% of what my team deals with on a day-to-day basis. And a single phish can take anywhere from 4 to 8 hours, soup to nuts, to really respond to, get it out of the environment, put the blocks in. So the attack is, inbound phishing email. Usually it's for financial crime, trying to get credentials so that the attacker can either log into your bank account, change your direct deposit information, any kind of financial crime.
Tax season. Love tax season.
Yeah. And generally it'll come in disguised as, Microsoft Help Desk, your OneDrive quota is almost gone. Click on this link, submit your credentials, and we'll go ahead and give you some more quota, or you can take care of this problem, right? So, unsavvy users, people who don't work in technology or security, have that mindset every day. They're like, oh, I I didn't know I had a OneDrive, but man, I can't run out of that quota. Click on the link and put my credentials in there. So generally, where we were is it was user reported. A couple hundred people would get a version of this email, and it would either have a malicious attachment, which installs code on your system and then propagates or sends out, I don't know how many of you have been dealing with Upatre, and, it reads your address book and then sends more email out and quickly spirals out of control. So we would get it manually reported to us. Yes, go ahead.
So we do have a limit. I usually hit it. It's about, I think it's 5 gig or something like that. I think that's what my limit is. It's actually a really substantial amount, and I store everything. So mine is recently hitting because I have
E-Discovery's worst nightmare, James Carter.
It's not as bad as if you catch it early. I mean, I think that's the main piece that we really focus on. The 4 to 8 hours, actually, probably a year and a half ago for us, wasn't even possible. A lot of times it was
days.
It was days or even weeks, or maybe we wouldn't even pick it up. We'd have some user go, "Hey, look, I filed I filed my taxes and it came back rejected." And I said, "Oh no!" And our friend, the Nigerian prince scam thing, is like going to town. And but now we've got the 4 to 8 hours, and that's really from detection all the way through to remediation, which is actually pretty phenomenal in comparison.
And this is without a lot of automation.
Without a lot of automation. And if you are able to detect it early, and we have, obviously some vendors that we rely on a few pieces, but if you're able to detect it early, the size of the mailbox doesn't really hurt you as much because usually you have a time window. So you say, okay, I know this thing came in during this window of time. So let me search through all the different mailboxes in our inventory and really just look at this specific time slice. And we're able to say, the email looks exactly like this. And then we can actually issue jobs where we say, push a button, go wipe that email off disk. So that's really...
You're getting into the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
So where you start out is, you're looking at headers, you're, looking in your email hygiene appliance and trying to figure out, the time slice and the other attributes that you want to pull out the message from. And we have people analyzing the attachments and the code, and then we have to identify the victims and work with, the various groups. And so then we, here it says contact IT messaging. Okay, this isn't just, sending off a quick email. It's opening a ticket and then contacting them via email, because even though it was a Sev 1, they didn't see it for a few hours and didn't respond, and doing this with multiple iterations of different teams, right? So this is very painful. And 4 to 8 hours, 4 to 8 hours, still is quite a long period of time for some of this stuff. Like I mentioned Upatre earlier, that propagated really, really quickly for people that, went ahead and looked at that awesome PDF. And so next we go to what it's going to look like tomorrow. Our goal is to get this to a 4 to 8 minute response time. So
we set the bar a little high.
We're go-getters. We really want to be, same scenario, financial crime, phishing email comes in, disguised as the awesome help desk email. Our goal is for our technology to detect it much faster. So you'll notice in the last slide it said 200 people received it and it was user reported. Here we're detecting it at 20 people before we even get an official notification, because we're looking at the behaviors and how this has changed and the differences in our email system. Still have the malicious attachment, still installs code. We're still looking through our SIM tools and those kinds of things, but we have automated responses now that where we push a button and it goes to the messaging system and pulls those emails out for us automatically. We're not having to contact the messaging team to say, oh, here are the attributes, and if you could write a PowerShell script to, with these attributes and pull this all out of everybody's inboxes, please, hope you did it right. It really removes a lot of that human interaction. And again, if we're catching it early, it's not as big of a problem in the environment. The impact is less. And if we automate this, if we take it down to 4 to 8 minutes, think about how much more time my analysts will be able to use for proactive hunting of things that may look legitimate, but still has malicious code attached to it. It's looking for those oddities, those anomalies in the environment.
The one thing I would add too is, like I mentioned, we have some strategic partnerships with some vendors, and while we cannot endorse any vendors as a nonprofit organization, they are here, and they do, one of the vendors that really helps out with this actually puts a nice little button in your Outlook email box that says, if this thing looks suspicious, click this button, and it basically wraps all that stuff up for you and sends it right to whatever location you need. So usually what will happen for us is that'll either go to Jessica's group or it goes directly to our threat intel team that analyzes it and goes, okay, hey, look, this is what that is associated with. This is the attack vector. Here are the indicators that we want to be careful of. And it automatically can wrap that into our incident response lifecycle with some of the automation and processes that we build in. So it'll do things like, okay, I know that it calls out to this certain command and control point or something like that. So let me, through an API with our IPS product, let me go ahead and put a block in. Or let me update something else in another location. So we have some automated processes that we've wrapped into that because our whole goal is to automate that incident response lifecycle. So there are a few strategic vendors that we use to be able to do that. And then we have just some smart folks that write a lot of code in Python that help us out quite a bit too.
Well, and with that threat intel tie-in, we may only be seeing one command and control, but maybe there's a lot more infrastructure behind that the attackers are also using. And so with that threat intel, we're not just blocking this one instance. We're blocking everything that we know about that attacker's infrastructure. And secondly, it also allows us to work with our behavior management group to increase and improve the kinds of education that they're providing out to our clinical staff and our researchers and the folks that are not necessarily in an IT position that don't necessarily readily recognize a phishing email or a scam and those kinds of things.
Yeah, we actually have a dedicated behavior management group, which is and it's got high visibility, meaning that we actually have a full team. There's a director that sits over top of it that goes out and basically is marketing for information security. So they're dedicated for that. They meet with all the physicians, staff, and for those that are familiar with the medical world, if you want to get anything done at a hospital, you go meet with the physicians. And they're usually, the administrative staff usually heavily outweigh the physicians. I think at Mayo, at least in Rochester, it's like 15 or 16 administrators to one physician. So it's a huge number, but that 3,000 physician number is probably the most important group that you can actually have as your advocate. So we have a group that focuses on working with our physicians and things like that to let them be aware of like the security world and how things have changed and that we're no longer this company in the middle of Minnesota that no one cares to hurt. We're the Red Cross van that goes across in wartime. Like, guess what? They blew that stuff up now. So they have to be aware of that kind of thing, that we're just not in the middle of a cornfield in Minnesota. So that's part of what the behavior management group does, but we have a dedicated group that does that.
So the next use case that I wanted to talk about is watering hole attacks. And so this is where, someone goes to, Forbes had this going on for a while. They had malvertising on their site. It took forever for them to get rid of it. Person probably going to a legitimate site or what they feel is legitimate, and it's been targeted by attackers, and some malware or malicious code has been put on that website, and it installs on the researcher's endpoint, for example. Now, this could take several hours or weeks or even months for us to figure out because we're, at this point, relying on, an antivirus signature or a beacon to be caught by, one of our other security appliances.
Or an FBI flash report or something that tells you, oh, by the way, however many weeks ago, some nebulous number, this happened, and here are the indicators you want to look for. Well, by that time, if we've been hit by it, it's already too late.
So in this situation, once we finally are made aware of it, if ever, we have analysts that manually gathers evidence, right? They're going out to the impacted workstations and trying to retrieve the malware. They're manually initiating an image of the system. They're manually submitting the malware to a sandbox and then manual malware analysis of that piece of code. Now, I'd like to point out that we're not saying that you can completely get rid of, manually analyzing the code, for example. You can certainly put it through some kind of sandbox and get some pretty good analysis on it, but you are still going to need probably, human eyes on that to look at some of the intricacies.
And unless it's like a really complex piece, usually that sandbox is going to give you at least enough intelligence that you can act and respond to it really. And the whole goal in that, people talk about actionable intelligence, but that's really the goal. You don't really, in my opinion, you don't need a full-fledged reverse engineer for every single piece of code you come across. That's what gets real expensive really quickly. But if you have some sandbox technology or, even if you use my way of running strings against something, you can usually get some indicators of compromise or some pieces that you can use to make it actionable right away. And that's really the focus too, is like, don't think that you have to reverse engineer every single piece of code.
So then again, you're manually creating tickets to all of the supporting teams to get the systems cleaned. They may or may not get around to it this week or next week, that kind of thing. And then, you're manually creating tickets to get blocks put in place. So where we're going is the triage will happen, or the response, will happen in minutes to a few hours rather than, this week, months kind of timeline. So, same process happens, and the way that we triage and analyze it is the analyst will readily have the information in the Smart SIM to respond to. It'll automatically, once it's determined that there's this malware on the system, the SIM will automatically send out responses to go grab the malware, grab a memory image, grab a snapshot of the system, put it in place so that it can be further analyzed by our humans. And then we can also put in automated responses to put a block on the firewall, put a block in the IPS, that kind of thing. And so this really reduces the amount of time that we are spent trying to figure out what's going on and waiting for manual processes to kick in so that our response happens sooner and it contains the damage. And
we mentioned the API conversation earlier. This is like the only way to achieve this is to force your vendors into creating this for you. We were actually pretty proud recently we were able to do automate some of this stuff where if we pick up something, and not just watering hole, but it could be a piece of malware or something like that, where we can actually maybe it's a syslog message, maybe it's some kind of other messaging platform that gets to your SIM product. Your SIM product will analyze it, and now you got to convert that to XML, and then you strip out what you need from XML, and then you take it from XML, and then it fires over through a Python script to something other. But that's the only way you're really going to be able to do this. And we've actually automated, actually just recently, to be able to say we have a detection product, and it's the company that I no longer work for, or their new company. But we have a detection product, and we've been able to say, okay, if something fires off this, and maybe it's not a watering hole, maybe it's an email, maybe it's something else, so automatically goes into our SIM. Our SIM goes, yep, I'm going to respond to that because I know what this looks like. And anything that I get from that product that meets this threshold, I know is bad. So I'm going to automatically respond to it. I'm going to tell this other product to go and grab a memory image and grab a snapshot or a live response. And so that way, before the analyst even knows that there's an alert, the data associated with how to actually triage that is already there. And so that's the part where we haven't released to, we've developed some of that stuff, and we haven't, we have to clear it with our vendors. But we might be able to assist if you have some of these products that we can endorse, but you can talk to us later about where we can automate some of that stuff for you.
So the last use case I want to talk about is it really gets into this idea of anomalous behavior. So, you have an employee that accesses directories for whatever reason outside of their normal access behavior. Turns out they're looking at sensitive research information, and for Mayo Clinic, this is a pretty big deal. We do a lot of research. We have a lot of groundbreaking, cutting-edge cancer research, other types of diseases. And so this is really our intellectual property. And so if someone starts looking at that maybe hasn't before or shouldn't be, we really want to know about that. So this goes unreported until someone tells us about it because they have a suspicion, or it just doesn't feel right, or, we may never be turned on to this. So when we are, again, the analyst is manually gathering evidence. They're manually getting an image of the system maybe. They're trying to figure out what the normal usage pattern for this person looks like. What are their normal hours of operation? What are the directories and the files that they're normally accessing? And is this truly different and something that we need to partner with our investigative legal support or whatever? And so then we'll have to contact the NOC and contact the investigative legal department and, all of these manual things that need to happen. So today this takes weeks or more, depending on if we ever really find out about it. So where we're going is with our SIM and the heuristics that are being done in there, baselining what that user behavior looks like and sending us an alert once that goes out of norm so it can be investigated. But at the same time that we're getting that alert, it's also sending off tickets to our forensic solution to grab an image of the hard drive, grab the logs from our Active Directory and domain controllers to say these are the normal usage patterns so that we can really analyze that quickly.
And obviously time is of the essence whenever these things happen, so if you don't get it within a certain amount of time, you might be out of luck. Question?
So are you talking usage patterns for every user? Because, I mean, there's a lot of people, there are a lot of people that work.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, that's a lot of data to have. Do you just have those resources
Well,
to hold that data?
Well, I think it depends on, obviously, if you look at it from a pure technology perspective, usually a lot of storage is involved. You gotta have
I have a petabyte.
You got to have a lot of storage, and so But we're probably unique. I mean, a lot of people don't understand the amount of data that we have. So as an example, we've kind of phased out our SIM rollout, and we just finished what we call phase 1, and it's a very small footprint, and it's 1.5 billion logs a day for that. So, and that's probably an eighth or ninth of the size of our environment. So we're rolling out more infrastructure, so we're going to hit right about 10 billion events a day. And if we don't try to normalize it and say everything kind of looks like this, what is this? That's the only way to really do it.
Not knocking the process.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome. On the side note, I was thinking, man, that sounds
Yeah, it's a lot of data. And I think that's a lot of it is understanding. You're going to have to understand what's normal and not normal, and that's the reason why we focus on behaviors more than the rules, right? Because the rules is going to say, "Hey, look, this kind of looks like this," and if we dealt with that all day long, that would be there's no way you can tackle that. So we really focus on behavior patterns more than like it kind of looks like this. And then we also have some other partnerships and some other rankings that we have internally of like, "Hey, look. This is probably the main thing we got to work. We have to prioritize it. So it's like, hey, if it's a system that controls our medical records, we may want to look at a little bit deeper with those kind of extraneous alerts. If it's something that deals with our payment systems, we may want to look at it a little bit differently. So we've kind of grouped what's important. And someone mentioned before about the BIA process and getting some of that data, but you group kind of what's important, and maybe you have different sets and different levels based on that data. We also have some stuff that we know of, like if this triggers. We know 100% we better drop whatever we're doing and jump on that one. And that's based on really well-known indicator sets of what may be more advanced attacks. And so you just have to prioritize it. Yeah.
So you mentioned incidents or log events. How do you do your metric for your staffing? Is it based on beds, users, events, incidents?
I will give the high-level answer, and Jessica does all my metrics, or does all the metrics for our group, because I
love metrics.
I have a short attention span when it comes to that stuff. But from a high-level perspective, you can't measure by counting widgets, and that's probably the number one thing. If you count widgets, if you count events, because here's the thing: if you go to a physician and you go, "Hey, we had 77 critical vulnerabilities, or we did 150 tickets," they have no idea what the heck that means. They don't know what the base is off of. They have no idea. And so what we've been able to do is, and that's actually, we have a slide on it, but really about measuring impact, and that's really what we focus on. So we actually only have about 3 or 4 things that we can measure impact on today. And it's really about, okay, yesterday it took us 4 hours to respond to this incident and get it from detection to remediation. Today it took us 1 minute. And that for them is like, oh, I got it. We just went 400 times or whatever the number is, better in our process technology and whatever we do to be able to protect our organization. They get that. So I think the metrics piece is you have to not count widgets, but you have to make it show measurable impact. And usually, a lot of times for us, that's time.
But counting widgets is important for your operations.
Yeah.
I mean, because you help with other healthcare systems, right? So what do they know is industry best practices? What's the Mayo way of doing it? How do they structure their security departments similarly, right? Do they do it based on bed count, event count?
The good part is we have security centrally managed. So usually our processes, I mentioned that behavior management group that we have, they go out and they work with those folks to see what's important to them and kind of gather that data. But as far as, we don't use bed counts yet. We don't use any of that stuff yet. But right now, they just know what's easiest to digest for them is 3 or 4 key things that say it used to be this and now it's this. And then they go, how does that impact the patient? So one of the things we want to do, and it kind of segues a little bit, and I think we only have a couple minutes, but is talk about, I mentioned we treat very important people. Some folks like to say we treat all people are important, and then we have some that are a little more important than others. We want to be able to use threat intel, our pen test teams, our red teams, as well as our response teams, and say before that patient arrives at our facility, 2 weeks before they arrive, we want to know who the threat actors that are actually targeting them, what exploits they're using to do that, what they're trying to compromise, what data they're trying to go after, go test the environment to make sure whatever floor that they are on is protected, and then deliver a report that says, not only did we do all this already, but we're also monitoring your systems to make sure none of this shows up. And to do that a week before they get there. And to hand that over to that person who's very powerful or high profile is a huge, huge win, because you can either, in my thought process is you can go to any hospital you want to. You can go to Hopkins, you can go to Cleveland Clinic, you can go to MD Anderson. So you can go to them and get really great care. Or you can come to Mayo and get really great care and understand that your data and you are protected. That's what we're looking to do. And we'll work with, that's where the partnerships with the business, compliance, and privacy, that's the end game for us, like 2015 end goal for this year is to have that report available to them before they get there. So really quick, I know we only have a couple of minutes to go over some of the threat intel pieces. Obviously, for people that are familiar with threat intel, we do the same thing everybody else does. We have documented threat intel, so we have both structured and unstructured data, and we can have an argument about what structured and unstructured means. But I look at a FBI flash report. A lot of times that comes in, even though it's a structured document, the data inside of it, you have to go through like OCR and a few other things to get it, because it's really unstructured from a ingestible perspective. So we have finished intelligence reporting, indicators of compromise that we get from a lot of different sources, some raw data types, PCAP files, things like that. We really want to automate this into our infrastructure as well. So we've got tie-ins to our SIM product from our threat intel team through an API connection that I'll cover just briefly. And what it'll do is if we pick up threat intel from the outside or inside, it automatically creates a rule into our SIM to go search around and make sure that we're not impacted by that. So when the FBI flash report came out on Sony, we said, okay, here's all the indicators for Sony. And instead of handing that over to an analyst and having them go do their manual searches through their SIM, we can actually create a job through the API that says, like, oh, look, when this comes in and we hit this button, automatically create that job and alert and this goes back to your question about weeding out some of the noise, alert the people that in Jessica's group if it hits. And so you don't ever have to go in and do that. Or already
has.
Yeah. So if it hits. And the thing about that is that if you try to do it for everything or you give them that work to do, how much of that noise now is in that system? You can automate all these pieces. All they may have is like, hey, we have a question. We saw Sony happen. Great, here's the threat intel report for Sony. But we already checked our environment. We're good. So we didn't want to bother you guys with that alert. That takes away so much off their plate. Threat intel system, I'm not going to go through all the different squares, but this is what we have. It's CRITS based, and for those that are familiar with threat intel, CRITS and Taxi are probably the two primary platform. It is the primary platform. It's a MITRE, came out from MITRE. But if you're part of any ISAC, if you're an FS ISAC, NH ISAC, or like that, they all have a flavor of this, meaning that they call it something else. I think they call it Avalanche in one of the groups and some other stuff, but they basically just rebranded something that's free. So CRITS and the whole Taxi kind of autonomy for threat intel is what we have set up. The difference that we have is that we also have a unstructured database that we're putting in. So we're using Mongo, but you can use there's a few different ones. You can think Lucene and some of those search capabilities there. But our focus on that is to take unstructured data sets like an FBI flash report, send it into our Mongo database, and make it searchable. And then once we get it to a structured state, then we put it into our CRITS infrastructure to basically categorize it and put it into the bucket that we need it to go to. But that's what the difference between, I think, what some of the other threat intel groups are doing and what we're doing is we're also adding the unstructured piece to it. And then we're using web interfaces, services APIs, and authenticated APIs, so I'm not going to cover that. Obviously, we get certain intel from healthcare and other communities. We also have SCADA systems or critical infrastructure now, so we have a lot of those different components. We do have a Cuckoo sandbox that ties off of it, so we can automatically have the TARC, Jessica's group, do searches, so they can be like, instead of offering up, here's one thing that we're trying to flush out now with our manager for threat intel, is don't open up the full CRITS web interface to your analysts, because junk in, junk out. And if you do that...
You don't want my team populating CRITS.
Yeah. So if you put in some of these sources, you can actually open it up where they can do, the analysts can do all this extra work. But if you have a separate threat intel team to make sure that the data stays pristine, the really functionality you want to open up to your analysts is, can I search IP? Can I search domain? Can I search an MD5 hash? Can you tell me about the specific group? Can I submit a piece of malware? Can I submit a piece of PCAP and get some data back? It's really all you really want to focus on. And it gives them enough data that they can do their day job without forcing them to also do a lot of the analyst work. So how much time do we have? Oh, we're out. All right. So won't go through this use case. Actually, was concerned that we may run a little short. So to summarize it, for us, you'll hear this from every single medical place. The needs of the patient come first. That's really what we're focused on. We want to be the industry leader and not just the healthcare industry leader, because that's a pretty low bar for us. We want to be up there with finance and government and things like that with how we do this. And it really is just focused on integrating all these different processes. So that's